Hello and welcome to this week's Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law and my guest today is the defense and security analyst and Gulf expert, Andreas Krieg. Andreas, good to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Amidst attacks and counterattacks between Iran and the US, on Monday, the Houthis announced a naval blockade of Saudi Arabia. What is your assessment of this latest escalatory move?
My first impression was why and why now? Because it's a major vertical escalation. Because obviously there's been in the talks, in the works over the last 2 weeks that the next escalation for Iran would be the blockage of, or some sort of interruption of freedom of navigation around the Bab al-Mandab, which is part of the sort of toolbox that Iran has available to itself. It obviously relies on a proxy, such as the Houthis, who act with a degree of autonomy as well. They don't just execute whatever the Iranians ask them to do. And the Houthis usually do what also serves their interest. But I'm surprised that Iran would do it at this point, considering that the Americans haven't gone all out yet. I mean, I think the Americans also have several options of escalation, which might be less likely, such as, going and grabbing land or occupying some of the islands in the Strait of Hormuz or even Khark Island. I think it's very unlikely the Americans are going to do it, but the Iranians then need to have another sort of vertical option of escalation, which then might be just more attacks on the Gulf. But then also I started to think about, the Yemen conflict, maybe a little bit more in isolation of the Iran-US confrontation, because obviously there's been a lot of development since January on the ground between the SDC, UAE-backed SDC that was pushed out, and the Saudis coming in trying to squeeze out the SDC and trying to take hold of all the non-Houthi occupied territory in Yemen. And they haven't necessarily done a very good job at this, it's a very difficult environment. Saudis obviously also cash stripped. They don't have the money right now to really effectively build a political system in southern Yemen. And there's been a lot of grievances, a lot of movement and mobilization by the SDC against the Saudi government. And the Houthis might want to and have looked to exploit this current weakness in the south to kind of get some land grabs here and there. And so that's been in the works for at least 2-3 weeks. We've seen mobilization along various fronts. And all of this is the backdrop to the Saudi bombing of Sana'a airport, which happened last weekend, which was a direct intervention by Saudi. Again, it's fairly surprising given the context of escalation that we have and given the belief in Saudi that they don't want to get dragged any further into the US-Iranian escalation. But I think for the Saudis, Yemen has always been a domestic issue and they're dealing with it apart from other issues that they might be facing. And so what we have here in Yemen is maybe a Houthi-Saudi escalation. The Saudis putting a red line saying this Mahan Air flight that was going to fly to Sana'a and there's a lot of credible evidence, had some Iranians on board. So there's this suspicion that the Iranians are trying to bring military advisors to the Houthis as they are trying to launch a military campaign in Yemen. And so that was something the Saudis were never going to let happen, and hence they made a very strong statement by bombing the airport in Sana'a, and to which the Houthis are now basically responding of saying, if you are blocking our airspace, we're blocking the naval supply routes to Saudi Arabia. And so this might still be outside of that escalation between the US and Iran, and that's my hope at least. And there might be a way that the Saudis can deal with the Houthis directly without the Bab al-Mandab necessarily becoming another bargaining chip for the Iranians in the broader negotiations with the United States, which is obviously something that we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, and there is so much up in the air and so much uncertainty, and the potential for mistakes, for blunders, for overreactions is huge. I'm wondering right now, though, the Gulf states that once again they're getting hit. They're getting hit hard. How vulnerable are they, and why do you think the Iranians are hitting them so hard? They're not hitting the Americans that hard, and they could be going after. I suppose they wouldn't, but they could be hitting some of those aircraft carriers that are carrying out the bombing raids.
Well, that's very difficult to hit an aircraft carrier. They're very well defended and obviously mobile targets. It's much easier to hit, and they're becoming much better, the Iranians, in hitting immobile targets and doing that very precisely with clear they must have some intelligence feed which has improved significantly, which suspects it's not an Iranian capability but a Chinese or Russian capability. But hitting aircraft carrier is extremely difficult. So they're going after U.S. military infrastructure, and we have to look at this infrastructure as being networked in a way. It's all connected. If you look at all these early warning systems, the radar systems, other intelligence reconnaissance systems that are spread all over the Middle East, from the north in Turkey, Iraq, all the way down to Oman. And all of them kind of feed into US CENTCOM intelligence feeds. And so the Iranians are going after every single node in that intelligence network across this entire, what is it, 3,000 kilometer line. They're also going after bases directly, going after tarmac, trying to immobilize these bases, which is very difficult to do because these runways can be fixed, and the US has different options. And anyway, many of the bases in the GCC have not been used for offensive operations and are still not being used for offensive operations by the Americans against Iran. They certainly weren't used in the first phase of the war, despite everything that the Iranians are saying. But why they're going after the Gulf? It is because it's the kind of weak underbelly, if you will, of US forward defense or forward offense, you should say, in the region. And they are very difficult to defend. They're very close in terms of geographic proximity to Iran. They can hit them and bypass their air defense systems. And also, you can do it with much fewer munitions, because obviously the Iranians have to think about the economy of war as well. It's not very economical to strike Israel because you will have to use the most expensive, most sophisticated technology and kit and missiles that they have to do so, and even then they might get intercepted. And it might not necessarily render the sort of impact and effect that you're trying to achieve. Putting pressure on the Gulf states will then immediately put pressure on Trump, because they've been lobbying Trump very hard, all of them, Qatar, obviously, Oman, UAE, Saudi Arabia, all of them very, very much making it very clear to the Trump administration that escalation is going to be to the detriment of Gulf stability and economies, but also to the detriment of energy supplies and the global economy ultimately. And Trump he doesn't have any options. He's a terrible negotiator, despite everything he's written about the art of the deal. He's terrible at getting to a deal. He's also terrible at sticking to a deal. And now again, we are where we were in March, April, where the US has run out of options. It's been mostly a horizontal escalation, but vertically speaking, we're now at the brink of getting into a vertical space of escalation, where we're hitting civilian infrastructure in Iran, to which the Iranians then respond by hitting critical national infrastructure in the Gulf, which is civilian infrastructure. And this sort of tit for tat is all about testing the resilience and the appetite for pain on the Iranian side and on the Gulf side. And the Gulf doesn't have a very high threshold of pain. It's a very low threshold of pain, and they're not very resilient, and so they are easy targets. But even there, we can see that the Iranians now must realize that there is only that much the Gulf states can do, in effect. They obviously, most of the bases are empty in the Gulf states because the Americans had to withdraw because of the vulnerabilities. We've seen the Gulf states all lobbying very overtly and quietly over the last 6 weeks, the Trump administration to not escalate further and honor the MOU and use the MOU as a handrail to get to some sort of deal. Now, punishing the Gulf states for that in this belief that this would push the Gulf states further away from the United States is, I think, a fallacy. I think what we're seeing now is that the Gulf states, in effect, are now rallying ever more around their own flag, and potentially, hopefully, around the Gulf flag as well, because they are now realizing the US is not there to protect them, but equally neither are the Iranians a partner you can deal with in order to potentially pivot away from US reliance. And so I think the Iranians are overplaying their hand, because what you're seeing now, particularly in Bahrain and Kuwait, is an ever more readiness to use military force against Iran, as we have seen. We've seen the same in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, a readiness to use force to kind of reset deterrence. And if Iran was choosing to punish the Emiratis and the Saudis in the same way they've been punishing the Bahrainis and the Kuwaitis, we'll most likely see the Gulf states using that force, Saudi and UAE, again to strike in Iran. And it might not do much, because the Iranians have a very high threshold of pain. But it just goes to show that ultimately what Iran wants to achieve is rallying the Gulf states around a a regional order without the Americans in it. What they're now doing is pushing the Gulf states back into the arms of the Americans. And ultimately, with Qatar in particular as the main mediator for the Iranians, the main channel to speak to Trump, to victimize them and not allowing them to export LNG is a very, very stupid thing to do, considering
Yeah,
how overly reliant they are on Qatar and also to an extent on the Omanis, who are, with whom they share the Strait of Hormuz. So
yeah,
hitting mediators and diplomats just kind of puts the Iranians into the same camp in many ways as the Israelis, who,
indeed,
seem
indeed.
unhinged, who are not reliable and who choose coercion over engagement. And, that's exactly what the Gulf states wanted to avoid.
Now the thing about the Gulf states and particularly the Qataris, as you mentioned, the Omanis, they have really pushed hard for a diplomatic solution. But looking at what they're up against with Iran, with Donald Trump, is that just a forlorn hope now? Is that road to diplomacy just shut down?
Looking at conflict studies in general, if you look at all the conflicts in history, that there was never a forlorn hope for diplomacy, ever. Doesn't matter how escalation pans out. What gives me hope is that on the tactical level, there are still talks. The Qataris have been to Iran last week. Iranians have been, the foreign minister's been traveling, have made phone calls. The Qataris are still, relaying messages within the GCC. I'm not as hopeless as some people out there are. I think there is still diplomacy there, and most importantly, on the strategic level, there's a readiness on the Iranian and the American side to return to the negotiation table. Ultimately, as stupid as it sounds, what the Iranians and the Americans are doing is using coercive means, military means, to improve their bargaining position at the negotiation table. This is not happening outside of negotiation. This is a means for negotiation. I think it's terrible. I think the idea of forcing someone through pressure to the negotiation table and trying to get concessions from the other side under pressure is not going to work. It's not going to work with Trump. It's not going to work with the Iranians either. So I think that they'll have to come to a conclusion, and we're getting there now after 8, 9 days of heavy bombardment on both sides. This conclusion that actually we don't have another option but returning to the negotiation table. The realization that there is only going to be ever a negotiation, a settlement to solve this problem. And I just hope, and it could come very swiftly because Trump, there's massive problems on the American side, obviously. On the American side, you have the issue of public pressure. This is the most unpopular war since Vietnam, and Vietnam needed a couple of years to become that unpopular. I think this war has become unpopular within the span of 5 months. So Trump is in a downward spiral in terms of public approval because of the war. The economy is now taking a hit. Gas prices and oil prices are up again, which is also bad for Trump. The US military is overstretched. They don't really have any sort of ways out unless they want to really go all in with 50 to 100,000 boots on the ground, which is the sort of war that Trump always rallied against. And also, they're running low on munitions. So we're coming to a point where the Americans can't sustain it indefinitely. On the Iranian side, the economy is taking a major hit. The regime security is built around the ability of the Iranians to extract rents from the sale of hydrocarbon. They're not selling anything at the moment, which means they can't really reinvest into the economy or give handouts to people. And this is already a highly aggrieved society anyway in Iran, and they might be ready to rally around, and we'll have another sort of uprising, which the regime really needs to and wants to avoid. So on both sides, strategically, the picture is not prepared. It doesn't show two sides willing and able to go to war all out. But the problem is, and this is where we're going to get stuck, is this no war, no peace sort of state of unpeace, of perpetual conflict that doesn't get resolved. That's where we are. That's the most likely trajectory, unfortunately, where we'll have spikes of escalation, then re-engagement and some sort of talks, then another spike of escalation, again talks. The problem here is ultimately for the Gulf states in particular and for global energy markets is what is going to happen to the Strait of Hormuz. is energy actually going to flow out? If we get a 10-day ceasefire, as the Qataris have suggested now, would they be able to bring LNG out and make sales overseas because they need money? The same is true for the Kuwaitis and the Emiratis. And if we now have the Bab al-Mandab closed for the Saudis will be in the same boat. So that's really what it comes down to, because a sort of no war, no peace, perpetual protracted conflict into 2027 is something the Gulf states cannot sustain indefinitely.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and Andreas Krieg, a senior lecturer at the School of Security Studies at King's College London. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to subscribe to our daily newsletter. Sign up, and you receive the first 2 months free. That's arabdigest.org. While this war is escalating, Israel is focusing on their scorched earth campaign in Lebanon, the ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and the Gaza genocide. The war, the escalation, the no war, no peace scenario serves Israel and Netanyahu's interests very well, doesn't it?
Absolutely right. Yeah. No, I had a call earlier with a journalist in Israel, and that's exactly the sort of conclusion we came to. That the current status quo is very good for Israel, because initially, when the MOU was signed, we were always looking at Israel as the greatest spoiler in this, because Lebanon is the other sort of unresolved issue. But it turned out to be the Strait of Hormuz, and it turned out not to be the Israelis, but the Iranians who became the spoilers because of internal infighting over which direction to take negotiations. And so the Israelis are off the hook. I think global public attention is turned away from Gaza because we are under this illusion that the war has ended, and a few Gazans killed here and there doesn't really interest anyone. The same is true for what happens in the West Bank, the ethnic cleansing, the terrorism by the settlers against the Palestinians. All of that is somewhat now a side story to where it was a year ago. And even Lebanon, where nothing has fundamentally changed, despite some preliminary attempts by the Israelis to leave certain villages behind, there is no intent by Israel to actually withdraw wholeheartedly. And the sort of diplomatic track that Trump has hastily put together is really not credible in terms of bringing the Lebanese and the Israelis together, when Hezbollah, as the kind of elephant in the room, is not addressed at all. And as long as the Israelis are still occupying Lebanese territory. So that is another sort of point of escalation that could come even if we resolve the Strait of Hormuz. But Israel, I think, is, as they're preparing for this election in October, I think Netanyahu would like to have a little bit of more insecurity that he can manage to kind of give himself the posture of a strongman. But to become this strongman, he needs to do escalation. He needs to have escalation that he can control, something where he can open the taps and close the taps. Iran is a sort of bigger issue that you can't just control. It's something that would blow up so badly that it might actually completely undermine his strongman argument. So he's probably looking for some smaller issues he can solve, whether this is Gaza or continuing doing something in Lebanon, maybe even in Yemen, because that's something he can turn on and turn off as he sees fit. But Israel actually would like to, and I think Smotrich made the point earlier this morning in an interview where he said, the current status quo, where the Americans are bearing the burden, getting ever deeper sucked into this degradation war against the Iranian regime, suits the Israelis perfectly fine, because the Americans are paying for it. No IDF soldiers are dragged into this, and Israel has a relative period of peace. And as they're preparing for elections. So I think that it works for the Israelis perfectly well. And the Iranians are, as much as they're posturing as, we're fighting the Israelis, actually they're fighting the Gulf states. And they're not doing very much to hurt the Israelis.
Yeah, yeah. Just turning to the UK, we have another prime minister, seventh in 10 years. Do you see any role for Andy Burnham to play that could or would make a difference, not just to the ongoing war, but to the ongoing situation in Palestine?
Well, we would hope so, wouldn't we? But I'm a bit more pessimistic, because the UK, as much as other European countries, are so preoccupied with themselves that domestic policy will always take precedent over what happens in the Middle East. There is no stomach for any wars. There's no money for any wars. There's no spare bandwidth or capacity for any wars. as we've seen with the Strait of Hormuz, which, nobody said the UK should get involved in this illegal war of aggression by Israel and the US against Iran. But when it comes to freedom of navigation around two main choke points, that was part of the grand strategic values, if you will, of the United Kingdom of Britain for hundreds of years, right? When even back to the days when Britain used to rule the waves. And now we just have one sort of frigate that we can send out there, which is pathetic. So we're just not in a place to do anything really. But what we would expect from the UK is take more leadership, moral leadership based on values. And we've seen some posturing, some narratives coming out of Andy Burnham, which suggests that he's trying to revisit what had happened 3 years ago and revisit some of the statements by the Starmer government. But ultimately, if you look at the leads in London, it's a compulsive environment where you can only go that far to criticize Israel without actually causing major problems to yourself and your political career. And I think Andy Burnham will now try to test where these boundaries are. And already there's been a massive backlash for his comment of saying we didn't get everything right when it came to Gaza, which was a very, very mild criticism, if at all, of Israel. And the pushback was extremely severe. So I don't think that Andy Burnham, has a lot of appetite to ruin his premiership over something that is not necessarily his core interest and his core sort of subject matter expertise. We'll see the new foreign secretary. What he tended to take usually a human rights based approach. When he was asked about it yesterday at Miliband, he didn't really have anything interesting or original to say. It sounded like same old, same old. But I think let's give them some time to reorganize. Certainly the Overton window of what is possible to say about this conflict now is much, much wider than it was 3 years ago. I think you get away with calling a spade nowadays. And there's a lot more genuine, organic pushback against the lies and deceitful disinformation pushed by Israeli talking heads who were on, general shows all over the country talking bullshit. Sorry, excuse my language. And so I think there's now more pushback against the country is more ready to actually empower the prime minister to do what is right within British values. It's not about Israel, actually. It's just about standing up for what are essentially British liberal values.
Yeah, yeah, and you're right. We're not seeing those talking heads from Israel spreading the BS as fervently and commonly as we were just even a few months ago. Um, just coming back to the strategic and military aspects of this war, who has the edge, Iran or the US?
Tactically, operationally speaking, I'd say the Americans have an edge just in terms of the technology they have, the bandwidth they have. But it doesn't really matter if you can't translate this into a political outcome. So putting pressure for the sake of pressure in an infinite, protracted war of degrading Iranian power and military capacity is in itself not strategic, and it doesn't lead to victory. So it really doesn't matter. I think what matters, this is a war of resilience. It's about who can sustain more pain, who has a higher threshold of pain and can sustain it for longer. And time, as I've said back in February, March, the time is always on the side of the Iranians. They're fighting for national survival. They're still in absolute national defense mode and survival mode. The way they act is far more sophisticated. They have more options because the options are not just military. The options are coercion and compulsion in the economic space, in the information space, in the diplomatic space. I think the Iranians have more options and a stronger will to survive. Trump's will to get rid of the regime is probably near zero because there's a realization that's never going to happen. But in terms of military capability, the Americans have a lot. But as I said, even that bandwidth is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller as this war continues, and it becomes ever more expensive. And so, yes, time and the will to sustain pain is really on the side of the Iranians, and that's why they have the upper hand in what is essentially a strategic standoff over both Lebanon and the Strait of Hormuz. And ultimately, if you really want to look beyond, in the bigger scheme of things, this is about a conflict over hegemony and who will rule the order after this war. It's not going to be the Americans. I also don't think it's the Iranians, but the Iranians want to come out of this war with a strengthened position where the axis of resistance is firmly embedded in Lebanon, is firmly embedded in Iraq and in Yemen. and where they control the two most important maritime choke points in the world, Bab el-Mandeb and the Strait of Hormuz. And they will do whatever it takes to do so, militarily, diplomatically, economically. And unfortunately, I think the future is one where the Iranians we have to give more credit to the Iranians as an authority in the region, and the Americans will come out of this war as a diminished power.
What about Israel then? If the Iranians and the Americans don't come out as the ultimate winners, do the Israelis?
No, but the Israelis have, I mean, as much as they're talking about a greater vision for the region, they never really offered one that is consensual. And I'm not saying that the Iranians are good in building consensus, but at least they know how to tap into certain communities, aggrieved communities, to plug in or inject their narrative of resistance. The Israelis have been very bad at this. They have no real communities outside of their immediate vicinity that they can tap into. And even the Emiratis, I think the Abraham Accords have now, to most Emiratis, look increasingly like a pragmatic trade over access to technology, a bit of influence in Washington, but it's not really, it's not a love relationship with the Israelis. And so among Arabs, among Muslims, there is Shia and Sunni. Israel is an absolute outlaw and a pariah, and that's not going to change. Gaza has completely destroyed it, and so Israel is so isolated right now in the region and globally as well that they can't really make a claim of leading the regional order. That's just ridiculous. And just because they have coercive power to strike and kill heads of state, for example, that doesn't make them omnipotent in any way. It actually shows their weakness, their desperation more than anything. And this idea, and I don't know where it came from, this idea that there would be an Emirati-Israeli sort of alliance or axis being built vis-a-vis a Sunni axis, it's illusionary. I think what the Israelis desperately are trying to do is plug into the Emirati axis of secessionists with links to the RSF, links to the LNA, links to the STC, links to Somaliland, obviously. But it's very desperate. And if the only sort of win that Israel has been able to score on the regional map has been a relationship with a breakaway region in Somalia, as in Somaliland, then that shows how pathetic Israeli diplomacy have become. Netanyahu can't even go to the White House anymore. I mean, he had to fake a visit to the White House last week, and the Trump administration just didn't give him the green light to come. So this is how isolated Israel really is. So I think Israel is so introverted, so focused on their bunker mentality that ultimately they think they don't need the rest of the world, they don't need the rest of the region, but it also means they can't lead.
Okay. Well, the next days and weeks are going to be most interesting, and I know you'll be keeping an eye on it, Andreas. But in the meantime, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Always a pleasure, Bill.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was the defense and security analyst and Gulf specialist, Andreas Krieg. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. Our support comes only from our subscribers. For more information on subscriptions, if you sign up, we're offering 2 months free. Head to our website, arabdigest.org. We are following the Iran war and other developments in the Arab world with analysis and commentary from a team of Middle East experts you will not find anywhere else. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of 350 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest, essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.